Right, well, I've got a handle on a scalpel here, which is, oh yeah, that did come loose. Is a very good fit for that slot. It allowed me to get to that without slipping. Unscrew that with my fingers. Okay, so under here we've got two springs. They were doubled up in that position. Normally you'd find one spring in that position. There are two springs in this position. Basically they act to push this down onto the top cover. You can see that there's little indentations here which line up with this little bump on the top cover. Now this is all lubricated with something white, which suggests to me a lithium based grease, and it also suggests that that was done at a fairly late date, because more typically you would see either a graphite grease or your traditional sort of yellowy brown grease in a position like that. So I'd say that that cleaning took place at the same time somebody did that, which means the camera is anything but in original condition. Somebody has had a go at it before I got here. That's alright, no harm done. I'll have a quick look at my shutter. Remove the rear group. Remove those shims. See if I can get the paper shims off without damaging them. That's good. And how does the shutter function? Well, it's quite slow. It's what's it like on a slower speed? What's it like on a 10th? And it's not too bad. Alright, that seems to be running reasonably well at the moment. Of course, it's in a warm room. Let's see if I can get that. Yeah, that front lens group's coming unscrewed. If at all possible, use your hands to get things like that loose. If you can't get it loose by hand, move on to a friction tool. And if you can't get it loose with a friction tool, you can move on to something else. But start with something soft and undamaging, like fingers and thumbs. Right, that's that front trim ring. We'll put that to one side. The shutter. Right, we could service the shutter. I've got a screwdriver here that's been ground down to leave 2 points to engage with that screw head, which actually it's a rivet. I'll just rotate that to unlock this. This just rotates counterclockwise so you can unbayonet it from the front. Take off the speed settings cam plate. I'll unhook the spring here from the main lever. This piece is referred to as the main lever. My shutter components here, the shutter release lever is coming straight off. This is the catch that holds the shutter in the cocked position. It's got a spring on it here which acts against this lever, and that lever is bent all out of shape. Someone's done something awful to that. Yeah, this shutter doesn't appear to have been serviced or hasn't been serviced in a very long time. That grease is yellow grease, and it's just very hard. It's just dried right out. So this is our B lever, and it's bent in the middle there. That piece there is bent at an odd angle. There's a shoulder screw here. Don't over tighten that one when you're putting it back, or you'll find that what happens is that the tiny shoulder on the screw, the edge of it just bites in to the aluminium mechanism plate and effectively binds on the lever, so that the lever is no longer free to move. This is the return spring for our shutter release. There's a spring on here tucked down into a groove in that body. Unhook that, that'll come up. And there's our 500th of a second speed spring. I think I can take the outer case off here now. It's 2 small screws, back those out. They just locate in little indents in the case. Oh, that must be a bit further recessed. I need to use a smaller screwdriver. That case comes off. Here's the detemps for our aperture settings. The aperture lever here doesn't want to move. I'm not going to force it. I can feel that the rattle of that tells me that those blades are well stuck with oil or grease. Right, this flash contact I want out. It's held in place with a single screw. Yeah, lift it out. Sometimes they don't lift out easily. And in that case you can pry under that bottom edge there with something very thin. The tip of a scalpel or something is a good thing to start with. If you can get the tip of a scalpel in under there, lift it up slightly and then get a screwdriver tip in there and work it, you'll find that you can lift that piece out. So I need to split that case. There are 3 screws at the back of the case. Where are we? Alright, here we go. These screws are tight. It's because the heads of the screws are pretty much glued in place with dried grease. That grease is dried out quite a lot. Okay, so that should allow us to split the case. Sometimes they don't come apart as easily as that. Here's our mechanism plate with the shutter blades on it. Now interestingly, the shutter blades look quite clean, but the diaphragm blades we know are very sticky. Perhaps someone's done a half-pie job on servicing this in the past. Now normally I'd rotate this lever to get access to the 2 screws here and here that hold the settings lever on the back. But there's no point fighting to get to that stage because I'm going to have it all apart anyway. So I'm just going to remove the retainer plate, remove the 3 screws holding the retainer plate in place, and tip the lot out. So there's our retainer plate. Here are the blades. Now, when they're when the diaphragms close down to a small aperture, it's quite normal for them to lift out like a rosette. They shouldn't lift out like this when they're out at full aperture. These blades are effectively glued together with oil. It's very, very sticky. So that needs to be done. Now we can get to these two screw heads here that I would have dealt with through the cutouts in this plate had I been able to get to them easily. Those screws weren't over tight, they were good. So here let's have a look at this. See, none of this looks particularly used. You know, all of these parts look like they've done virtually nothing. So it's a camera that's never done a lot of work. I'm quite convinced of that. It's probably seen more work in the hands of repairmen than it did in the hands of a user, I would say. Never mind. These parts will all need to be cleaned. And while I'm working on the shutter, I think I will go away and put these parts from the body in the ultrasonic cleaner and get them buzzing away in some solvent. I'm going to start cleaning up the components for the shutter. So I'm just starting with Naphtha, cigarette lighter fuel. And first thing I need to do is clean the shutter case to remove any oil and grease and of course dust and dirt that may have built up. This particular camera of course has done very little work by the looks of it. Everything appears to be quite clean as these things go. There's a location screw in the back of the shutter at that point that's just catching on my cotton bud, so I have to get rid of those threads of cotton. Of course it's the inside of the case I'm mostly concerned with. It's looking pretty good. I always start with the diaphragm components, well usually start with the diaphragm components. This is the moving plate, the plate that's connected to the settings lever for your aperture, and this swings through an arc and swings the blades as a result, inwards or outwards. This is quite oily. This is the face that goes towards the case. This is the face that goes towards the blades. Now I had occasion just the other day to strip and clean a new old stock synchro Compur shutter that was for a Retina 1A or 2A camera in that case. And it was interesting to have a look at that shutter because it had never been used in a camera and had never of course been serviced before, and I was able to have a close look at the state of finger marks, because finger marks, I've certainly noticed them frequently on shutters that I've serviced in the past, and what I noticed in that case was that the diaphragm components were entirely free from fingerprints, but the mechanism plate was not, which means that whoever had been assembling the diaphragms into the cases in the Decal factory were far more careful with their work habits than the people who were assembling the mechanism plates. There's some slight staining on this case around here, but there's nothing notable. That's fine. This is the retaining plate that holds the blades in position, and this side here with the 5 dimples on it is the side that faces the shutter blades. You can see immediately there's oil and stuff on there. Let's see if I can get this clean. That white arc across there, I think, was that lithium grease from the film reminder dial springs. I think I just popped this down on top of them while I was taking it apart. This face, the dead plain face, that faces the diaphragm blades. And in this shutter, the diaphragm blades were the oily ones. To the extent that they were actually stuck. When the diaphragm blades are stuck from oil, and someone comes along and decides they want to make them move, they run a great danger of actually physically damaging the blades, and one of two things will happen, or a mixture of both. The rivets that form the pivot points on the blades may get pulled out of the holes that they rotate in, or they may be torn off the blades completely. Or particularly if you're pushing the blade from fully open to a closed position, or closing it down, you're pushing on the end of that blade, the other end doesn't want to, nothing else wants to move. You may end up with blades that distort and get twisted, get a bend in them. And of course the problem with blades that don't lie flat is that it's very, very difficult to reassemble the diaphragm. So this is our settings lever. I'm interested to see how oily this is, and it doesn't appear too bad as these things go. It's normal for there to be a wipe of grease on there, and it's not showing anything more than that, so that's not exactly soaked in oil. But the blades, the diaphragm blades, certainly were quite oily, so that's a bit of a mystery. The diaphragm blades, I've got to clean. These will have to be, these are a bit delicate because they've got the little rivets on them that form the pivot points. It's easy to catch your cleaning cotton bud or Q-tip on the blades, and if you catch it on the blades you could bend them or otherwise damage them. So here I'm holding it down with the back of this curved pair of tweezers. I'm not applying much force, I'm just stopping the blade from running away. Otherwise you'd be in danger of damaging the blades too. That blade looks good. Now I'm going to go through these 10 blades, clean them all, get rid of all the oil, then I can reassemble the diaphragm. I'll start reassembling the diaphragm now I've got everything clean. So I'll start with the retainer plate, and this goes plain side up. The side with the 5 wee dimples in goes down. And then I want a toothpick to help me manoeuvre blades into position. And I've got my blades all lined up carefully on a piece of paper so I can pick them up and place them. Now the blades are not symmetrical. The pivot points are closer to the centre line of the blades at one end, and close to the outside edge of the blade at the other. So you need to be aware of that, and putting the blades in the retainer plate here, the pivot closer to the middle of the blade goes downwards into the retainer plate. Now the first 6 blades are easy enough. You just lay them down one on top of another. But after that we've got to pull the first blades, swing them back out of the way to get access to the holes that these blades go in. Now that one's not sitting flat. It won't sit flat. I don't know whether the blade underneath it is not seated. Well, it appears to be seated. So this blade's slightly bent. I'll have to fight with that later. I've pulled back that blade slightly to allow me to get access to this hole. And do the same again. Of course, it'll be a very delicate job this. It's easy to knock this and disturb everything and then have to start again. And that's not uncommon. I mean, now I've done thousands of these. I can probably get them right 3 times out of 4 first time. If you take 2 or 3 attempts to achieve it, that's okay. Each attempt is just another 5 minutes out of your day. Last one. Now I've got to swing these blades back over the top without disturbing the one I've just placed there. Now I hope that all the blades are still correctly seated in their correct positions. Alright, on this retainer ring there are 3 screw holes where this fixes to the case. 2 of them are fairly close together. And this one goes where? There. It's getting this seated over the top of those pivots, and it's not going particularly well. I can pull some of those blades into position. Just using the tips of my tweezers here to pull those pivots into position. Now one there is well out, so I've just got to see where it is and slide my tweezers in underneath. Slide it across. It probably means it's not seated correctly in the fixed plate, the retainer plate, but I can probably wriggle that into position. Okay, that's not looking too bad. What about this side? I've got one here that's not seated correctly. That's it. Now I can get the case on over the top. There are two holes here and here. They're the ones that go in those two holes, that fix to those two holes that were fairly close together. So I lower the case over, wriggle that down to get it in position. I'm going to flip this over, lift my jig up, slide it underneath, and you can see it's not sitting dead flat. I'm looking to see where those pivots are. I can see some of those pivots are not in the plate. In fact, there's quite a few that aren't in the plate. This is not going smoothly. So I can rotate this plate to get it where it should be on the housing. I'll get 3 screws in here and get them started and see if I can draw those blades into position. Don't do the screws up tight, because if you do the screws up tight you won't be leaving enough room to get the blades pivots into position. I just want the plate to stay where it's put, not be rotating on me. Okay, now I need to find a needle. Well, even better, I've found a dressmaking pin. It's got a nice big head on it that I can grab hold of. And what I want to do is move these blades, their pivots, into position on the plate. And I'll just tighten these screws up slightly so that these will stay in position once I've got them there. It's gone reasonably smoothly. Got one that's out of position here that I can't quite see the pivot on that one. I've got one blade that's displaced slightly. Slapping these two screws off slightly. So I can just about see the rivet there. Yeah, I can see it. Well, just pushing that blade over at that point. Now I can see the rivet. Yeah, it's in place. So all the blades are in place in the fixed plate. I'll do those screws up very lightly. And now I want to see whether they're in the moving plate correctly, and they are. So my diaphragm's moving smoothly and freely, and the blades are nice and clean. So I can tighten those three screws up. And I can fit the aperture settings lever to that now. That moves nice and freely. There's absolutely no drag on that at all to speak of. Where's the lever?